Welcome to FA Exclusive. I'm Atul Singh.
And I'm Glenn Carl. And today, this month, we have two issues to close the year with, rather than three. The first, the Houthis, the Red Sea, and then the geostrategic or tectonic shifts that the actions in the Red Sea by the Houthis imply. And the second
is China's worsening deflation and what that means for the world. So without further ado, Glenn, take us through what's going on with the Houthis.
Yes, I think the actions of the Houthis and what's happening in the Red Sea, although it's been in a front headline subject for the last week or 6 weeks, is more significant than most observers and commentators have said or focus on. To me, we're living, as I think most of us probably are aware of, one of the great moments of historic shift in history. Certainly in my lifetime, and I'm now 67. I think there's only one time in my life that is of similar import, but it was much simpler because the answer was known as it was playing out, and that was the end of the Cold War in, let's say, 1989. Otherwise, the world was, from World War II until 1989, if convulsive, in a stable system. From 1989 until roughly now, the years that we're living, similarly relatively stable. But in this moment that we're living, and why I think the Houthi actions in the Red Sea are so significant, we are experiencing transformation in how the world functions or doesn't function. And we don't know the answer. We don't know how this will come out. So I think we're living the most significant or unstable phase in history since really 1945 or since 1938, or however you want to say. So why? What's happening first? Well, I think most of us know that the Houthis, which are an ethnic group in Yemen, there's been a civil war, really, a proxy war, as many of them tend to become, in Yemen between the Shia and Iranians, in particular Iran, really, and the Sunni and the Saudis, in particular the Saudis, for control over this desperate, near famine, near mass death country or geographical area that's considered a country but really is dysfunctional. So the Houthis have done quite well there, despite rather gross and crude efforts by the Saudis for the last 8 years, I think.
I mean, the Saudis, it's difficult for them to do well when you have fat brigadiers who fall flat on their face.
Well, they have equated, as other militaries before them, I guess, the number of bombs dropped with the likely success that would result, and that seems not to have been how it's played out. So there's a stasis between the Houthis and the legally recognized government, between the Iranian-backed Houthis and others. But the reason that's significant is because the Houthis have become a surrogate, well-armed, and although not completely a puppet of, nonetheless responsive to the geostrategic policies and objectives of Tehran. So they have struck the Houthis with missiles and with commando raids, the cargo ships into the Red Sea. Now, the Red Sea is, when you look on a map, you think it's not that large. It's as large as California, which makes it probably 800 kilometers long by 200 kilometers wide, very grossly put. where, and Atul knows the data better than I think a quarter of the world's trade passes. Is that about right?
Yeah, a quarter by some estimates. And as per the latest figures, Nikkei Asia, which is outstanding when it comes to economic news, particularly on Asia, as per Nikkei, the situation is actually pretty dire. About 20% of the world trade is under threat. Even perhaps more importantly, already 121 container ships are avoiding the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. And there are many companies that have refused to operate there. Hapag-Lloyd is one of them. Maersk is another. BP is not sending oil through the Red Sea and the Suez. I mean, the Red Sea and the Suez, let's think of the choke points there. One is, of course, the Suez Canal itself, which is perfectly fine. Back in 1956, there was the misadventure of the Anglo-French and Israeli expedition. This time, there's no such misadventure there, although Gaza is not too far away, but that's not affecting the Suez. It's the Bab al-Mandab that's affecting, and the Red Sea and Houthi pirates who are conducting drone strikes. And it's really difficult for ships to protect themselves against drone strikes. They can protect themselves against, say, physical attacks by having ex-SAS people or ex-Navy SEALs people or any private military company. But, and here's the but, B-U-T with a capital B-U-T, it's really difficult to protect against drone strikes as of yet, because it's simply too expensive. You can have jammers, you can have other stuff. We have our colleague Sanjay Acharya, who's an expert on this sort of stuff, and he can educate people further about it. But the reality is that at the moment, the risks are too high, the costs are too high, and this has caused the equivalent of a heart attack to the global economy.
So the Houthi have attacked these cargo ships. A significant percentage of world trade passes through. It's true the Suez Canal has remained open, but only 2 years ago the Suez Canal was closed. It's not hard to close it. But even if you don't close the Suez Canal, as currently is the situation, in a way it doesn't matter, because if ships won't take the Red Sea, the Suez Canal becomes irrelevant. Yeah. I mean, it is shut down by itself.
It's like a coronary artery. It's exactly like a heart attack.
There, at the same time that the Houthi have, since October 17, I think that it is, which is a direct consequence of the fighting in Gaza, there have been also 104 strikes by Iranian-backed groups, militias, in Syria and in Lebanon against U.S. personnel facilities in the region, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, and so on. One should view those attacks as of a piece with the Houthi actions in the Red Sea.
Maybe you should have attacked Iran, not Iraq, in 2003, Glenn.
Well, many of my erstwhile colleagues, in particular on the right and in the military, said that we had attacked the wrong target. That is true. I'm not agreeing. What is true is that is what they argued for. So why are they doing that? The argument of the Houthi, and I know for a fact, and I know firsthand of the Iranians, because I've been in a number of point-counterpoint interviews with Iranian representatives on the subject, is that it is a humanitarian effort on the part of the Houthi to bring justice to the Palestinians and to stop the, quote, genocide, unquote, of Palestinians by imperial, racist, Zionist Israel. and their backers, the United States. That's their position, and it's a very powerful one, actually, because of course there's broad sympathy for the Palestinian suffering and outrage against Israel for what's happening this moment, but also what the circumstances have been for decades in Israel and Palestine. That's what is happening on the surface, but it really is the surface. The Houthi would not be doing this, and the militias in Iraq and Syria would not be striking the U.S. If they were not encouraged strongly by Tehran, by Iran. And so the real objective, or at least a deeper objective, if not the deepest one, is to create problems, of course, for Israel, to focus attention on the Palestinian plight, to create problems for imperialistic America and its presence in the Middle East, to make things so complex and painful that the U.S. either becomes mired in an unsolvable series of circumstances, as it did in Iraq, as the United States did in Iraq, and feels compelled to accelerate its slow, progressive, and actually desired withdrawal from military involvement in the Middle East. But deeper than that, Iran clearly, and Hamas on October 7 clearly is seeking to refocus attention on the Palestinian plight and to have Iran remain strategically influential and relevant in the Middle East. The peace agreements, what are called familiarly the Abraham Accords, the general trend of history for decades, and the intense negotiations among Saudi Arabia, the United States as the broker, really, and Israel for a peace treaty, an even broader peace treaty, which would have brought strategic, or may well still bring strategic, economic, political, humanitarian benefits to the entire region, would have done so, it appeared, once again, at the cost of the Palestinians being ignored and continuing to be the great losers in history in the region there with the Kurds, who no one pays any attention to. And Iran would have been further pushed out of its relevance in the Middle East and the struggle with the Sunni for regional control.
Glenn, something important to bear in mind is that the Iranians and the Saudis have kissed and made up thanks to Chinese mediation. So Iran has been playing its cards quite astutely in the Middle East. Hamas is, after all, Sunni, and Iran is Shia, and yet there's a close relationship between Iran and Hamas. In fact, Iran has rivalry with Azerbaijan, which is a Shia country. In fact, Azerbaijan has close relationships with Turkey and Israel. That is what led them to victory against Armenia. That's a long piece we published 2 days ago. And if we look at the geopolitical situation in the Middle East, it really gets very, very complex, far beyond the Shia-Sunni divide. Mm-hmm. And my question to you is, the U.S. killed Qasem Soleimani, the superstar, pop star, rock star. He wasn't quite. He wasn't a superstar, pop star, rock star, but he was the equivalent of that. He was
a hero,
an astute. Yeah, he was an astute, wily, strategic military commander who did unleash a lot of carnage for the U.S. But the U.S. managed to kill him. So who is now the kingpin or the general or the strategists in Iran moving the pieces? Because they seem to be doing a decent job. It's almost as if Qasem never died.
Well, I don't know the answer with specific individual names, but I do know the Iranians are very sophisticated practitioners of diplomacy, realpolitik, military strategy. No one should ever underestimate the sophistication of the Iranian regime and its civil servants and servants. It is true, the Iranian Saudi agreement brokered by the Chinese, a triumph of Chinese diplomacy, actually, is significant, but it also hasn't made the lions and the lambs lie down together. It's in the interest of each party to ease tensions, but it has not removed the strategic competition in the Middle East between those two parties, and more broadly to affect increase their influence, in particular in Iran's case, to the extent possible at the expense of removing the interloper and infidel, American. So I think you have these several layers occurring all at once, and they're in the Red Sea actions by the Houthi. And there's the largest one of all is why this is particularly fascinating and significant, this being what's happening in the Red Sea by the Houthi and the consequences that entail as a result. And that is what I led off with, which is, where is the world going as regional and global powers rise to end, really, the unipolar American hegemony? And in three cases, which is China's, Russia's, and Iran's, directly seek to overthrow, challenge, and replace the American system, which its defenders and proponents would call the normative one, and its critics would call an American imperial one. The two things, it's a Venn diagram. They're not mutually exclusive at all.
Well, of course, America wrote the rules of the game, post 1945. It came up in Bretton Woods with the financial architecture, the financial system that underpins the global economy. The IMF and World Bank, the International Monetary Fund and World Bank were born, and they are strategically located next to the White House so that people like you can keep an eye on them. The United Nations is in New York, and you can compromise every foreign diplomat with honey traps. So it's all jolly good. The rules-based system is good for you.
And for everybody else, of course.
Especially the honey trap diplomats
system. So the U.S. of course acts in its self-interests. I think the ultimate question as to the merit of the system is, can another player which is less powerful, and by definition up until now all have been less powerful, also benefit in a way greater than any other system? And in most instances, that the answer to that is yes, it can. When the U.S. vital interests are at play, the U.S. of course has acted as ruthlessly as any other state ever. But one must also acknowledge that when challenged on most issues under the rules, the U.S. will generally grudgingly concede the points. I think that the glaring exception has probably been the Asian financial crisis, when the Department of Treasury was just completely ruthless, advocating narrow U.S. interests at the expense of an entire region. But
this is 1997 for our listeners and our viewers. This is 1997, the great financial crisis, which traumatized Asia. And in the words of the late Lee Kuan Yew, Singaporean Prime Minister, it tore up not just the economic order, but also the social fabric of the region. But yes, crack on, Glenn.
Yeah. Now, arguing that's a fascinating topic, but arguing and acting, doing their best to stop that kind of predation, frankly, were significant American policymakers, notably President Clinton's economic advisor, Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winner. But that's an issue for another day. To return to the Houthi Red Sea geostrategic issue, there's something else which has not received almost any attention, even though I've been on the Indian media in the last week on this subject, and Indian followers of international relations and of India's interests are paying some attention, but I think even they are not focusing directly on the following sufficiently. As the major players in the world evolve, as China obviously has risen and continues to rise, as Iran's power has increased, as Russia has been resurgent, all three of them seek clearly to push America away, to supplant the American system with as the Chinese and the Russians would define it, I forget the term.
Multipolar.
Well, that's a nice way of putting it. I was a little different. No,
spheres of influence
in the domestic affairs. There is no universal system of laws or obligations under their system. There are only individual nations will decide their own course of behavior. Therefore, human rights for the Uyghur or border sovereignty for the Ukrainians are not legitimate topics of protest or interest by anyone except for the protagonists themselves, which is certainly not the system, the universal system that the West has tried to create and impose with the rise of the nation state and Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Charter and so on. So, but where does this get us with what's the other great global power whose the recognition of whose power lags behind the reality, I think, and that's India. And I don't say this because Atul is Indian and he has focused my attention progressively on Indian things. It's a fact. India has, just in recent years, since Modi has become the ruler of the country, the leader of the country, a progressively active actor in international affairs. Its power economically and militarily, and then its aspirations politically and geopolitically have risen in concert. And so what will India do? Now, India is disproportionately affected by what the Houthis are doing in the Red Sea. Global trade's affected, but India's trade is more directly affected than any other countries, I believe.
A very quick historical point here, Glenn. The Suez Canal was built as a lifeline to India. It was to ferry troops to India in case there was a repeat of the 1857 uprising or rebellion. And it was also to ease transport of commodities to Britain and to enable the transport of finished goods for which India was a market. And it therefore caused the de facto conquest of Egypt.
Mm-hmm. So what has been the response so far to what the Houthis have initiated, what's going on in the Red Sea? It's a classic one up to now, which is that the United States has called for and created, or is in the process of creating, an international response, a, quote, coalition, unquote. At present, there are 12 nations involved. 2 notably are not. Now, before I get to those 2, so the 12 nations will patrol the Red Sea and the approaches to it to make sure that the international trade can flow. At present, the United States has 6 ships that it has been using to try to enforce the, quote, law of the sea, unquote, in the Red Sea. That's 6 ships over, I don't know how many million square kilometers of water, to which will be added 11 other nations' ships, which is good. Absent, so far, are Saudi Arabia, which wants to keep its head down towards the Houthi and not to get embroiled directly in a military clash, frankly, with Iran, and India, which I'll speak about in a moment.
So it's 174,000 square miles, 450,000 square kilometers, an awful lot of water.
Yeah, I know firsthand that the United States, when I was working, had 12 ships with which to patrol the United States coastline from the Mexican border in the Atlantic to Washington, D.C. And that was thousands of kilometers of coastline with 12 ships, and it was functionally impossible, to the point so that literally no action by the United States internally or at sea or internationally ever had any effect, zero, on the price of any illegal drug being smuggled into the United States. Zero over decades. So it's a similar challenge, potentially, to stop a few men on Zodiac boats in the Red Sea. So why is it important, and why is it at present not doing anything except for saying, well, someone should enforce the international law because this is not great for us? And so far, I have found India's response to be in line with its historic practice, which is to seek, understandably, to benefit from the international trade system while decrying any great power action, which means the U.S. on the whole, and refusing to become a participant in its enforcement. Now, why has India done that? There are historic reasons. The Soviet Union in India was perceived as a friend materially and politically during the early decades of India's independence.
And ideologically, especially after Indira Gandhi.
And India doesn't want to be part of any sort of great power cartel ruling the world. Well, yes and no, because India is progressively acting now to project its power and defend its interests internationally in a way it never has done. Never until Modi, really, beyond its bordering region. And I think there's a clash, frankly, between India's interests and its practices. Who can add materially, in all senses of the term, to the stability of this system? And it really is progressively India. But India has not yet taken the active steps, at least in this current crisis. There are many other steps that India is evolving into with respect to the South China Sea and the South Pacific and Indian Ocean. But so far it hasn't married actions to its interests, I think.
So quick thing, to give some context, there was a ship called King Pluto. And this ship was on its way from Saudi Arabia to India. It was linked to Israel. Now, the ship, as shipping companies go, it was Liberia flagged, Japanese owned and Netherlands operated chemical tanker. So go figure what's the connection to Israel. Maybe there is. Anyway, the Houthis thought there was a connection to Israel. The Houthis, of course, or maybe someone else attacked it with a drone strike. We have somebody sending us a question that, well, the CENTCOM promptly accused Iran of the drone strike. However, is it possible that Pakistan did it? And the favorite conspiracy theory of Victoria Newland, she met the Pakistani Army Chief Asim Munir. Could that be behind it? Well, we don't know, but the point is that India since has deployed warships. India has indeed taken some action. 3 warships have been deployed to the Arabian Sea after the attack on the tanker. So, and this is news that came out a day ago. So, India is taking some action. And let's remember that this attack was not in the Red Sea area. It was not in Bab el-Mandab. It was not even close to Yemen. It was just 200 nautical miles which is 370 kilometers off the western coast of Gujarat, which is home to Modi and which is home to India's greatest entrepreneurs.
That's very important. I had not, did not know, pardon me, that India has in fact deployed its ships, which of course is in its own interest, but in this instance, at least in the way that France associates itself sometimes with international actions without formally becoming a part of it, it sounds at the very least that this is what India is beginning to do, which would be quite significant. Because what's the import, just to conclude, I think the largest forces at play and consequences of what will happen. Of course, the actions do have some effect, if only rhetorically and in a focus, which is significant, on what is happening or what is the nature of the clash in Gaza with Israel and with the U.S. Involvement or lack of actions there. It affects regionally Iran's influence or declining influence in the region and the U.S. It affects, as I touched upon before, the larger Iran, Saudi, Shia, Sunni play of forces in the entire region. And then beyond that, you have this larger clash of the frittering away of norms, the rise of sphere of influence and independent nation sovereignty by the other great powers, China, Russia, and Iran. And Iran's not a proxy or a tool directly of China and Russia the way the Houthi are of Iran, but they are in this instance de facto allied in objective and probably more directly than that even. So this will affect the U.S. and Western influence, the nature of the international system as it evolves. If the Houthis succeed in continuing to shape the narrative and the actions in the region, then it will have consequences for international trade negotiations, for the outcome of the South China Sea disputes, even along the Chinese-Indian border in the war in Ukraine. It will shape the responses of all nations and their expectations about what the United States or China, just to cite two, can achieve by their respective unilateral actions. And I think it's a time for choosing, an expression I can't remember the origin of which, but a famous one, for India, as it clearly has become and progressively becomes a global power and player, about what it wants to see shape how ships sail through the Red Sea and towards India and past. And India has been, over 20 years, evolving to closer, frankly, integration, not just economically, but politically with the Western norms. And this is a moment where I think it needs to align itself more. Now, I'm speaking as a former American official. It's a classic American position to take. I think it's a strong one to defend, though. And I haven't found compelling the counter-arguments by the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, or the Indians.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.